Essential question. What is the cultural heritage of American descendants of slaves? If you do not know, that is what today's learning goal will be, for you to be able to recognize, encourage, and support the ethnic heritage, language, and cultural identity of American descendants of slaves. Why this is important? Because knowing the cultural heritage of slaves is critical to instilling morals and knowledge into the new generations. The ACE pyramid. Did you know that negative experiences in childhood and the teenage years may put children at risk for chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance use in adulthood? These negative experiences are known as adverse childhood experiences. ACE. Some populations are more vulnerable to experiencing ACEs because of the social and economic conditions in which they live, learn, work, and play. In other words, as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for negative outcomes. I'm going to look at some of these early adversity impacts that last due to the adverse childhood experiences, and some of the outcomes that negatively impact the life lead to injury, traumatic brain fractures, and burns. Adverse childhood experiences leads to mental health issues like depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD. Adverse childhood experiences leads to maternal health issues like unintended pregnancies, pregnancy complications, fetal death. Adverse childhood experiences leads to infectious diseases like HIV and STDs. Adverse childhood experiences leads to chronic diseases like cancer and diabetes. Adverse childhood experiences leads to risky behaviors like alcohol and drug abuse and unsafe sex. Adverse childhood experiences lead to opportunities and education income. So what I would like to focus on is what leads to these adverse childhood experiences that the Black community, the African Americans, are experiencing today. Because it is very important to recognize the historical trauma and the generational embodiment within the local contexts in these social conditions that the Black community was placed in. So adverse childhood experiences are categorized into three groups: abuse, neglect, and household challenges, and refer to the respondent's first 18 years of life. Abuse is the emotional abuse, physical and sexual. Household challenges like mother treated violently, substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, your parents were ever separated or divorced, incarcerated house member, and neglect, emotional and physical. So the problem is, we know that early experiences literally build the architecture of the brain, and that safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments are key to building a solid foundation for future growth. We also know that not all children have access to the kinds of experiences that will benefit their development. Some children experience adversity that is so severe and persistent that it produces toxic levels of stress that harm the brain's developing architecture. Some populations, like the African American community, are more vulnerable to experiencing ACEs because of the social and economic conditions in which they live as a result of their historical trauma, quote unquote, slavery, which is historical trauma for Black people. Now, slavery in the United States was the legal institution of human chattel enslavement, primarily of Africans and African Americans, that existed in the United States of America from its founding in 1776 until passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Slavery was established throughout European colonization in the Americas. From earlier colonial days, it was practiced in Britain's colonies, including the 13 colonies which formed the United States. Under the law, an enslaved person was treated as property and could be bought, sold, or given away. Slavery lasted in about half of U.S. until 1865. A brief timeline of the transatlantic slave trade. 1619, about 20 Africans brought to Jamestown, Virginia, so they say as indentured servants. 1776 to 1790, the American Revolution ends, and British controls ends British control. 1776 to 1790, the American Revolution ends British control of the colonies. The U.S. Constitution does not end slavery. 1808, the United States Congress abolishes the transatlantic slave trade but does not end slavery. And that's going to be very important to remember moving forward. And in 1865, the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. Still on a brief timeline of the slave trade, because it's been a journey ever since those first Africans was brought here in Jamestown, Virginia. So beginning in the 17th century and continuing through the mid-19th century in the United States, enslaved African Americans resisted bondage to gain their freedom through acts of self-emancipation. The individuals who sought this freedom from enslavement, known as freedom seekers, and those who assisted along the way, united together to become what is known as the Underground Railroad. So, Spanish Florida was a haven for escaped slaves and for Native Americans deprived of their traditional lands during colonial times and in the first decades of U.S. independence. The Underground Railroad ran south during this period. 3 autonomous Black communities developed in Spanish Florida: Fort Moses, St. Augustine, and Angola. When Andrew Jackson became Florida's de facto territorial governor in 1821, he saw Angola's destruction as a first step in plans to rid the peninsula of runaways. Jackson's first order of business was to send his Creek allies on a search and destroy mission against Angola, which was burnt to the ground. The result of the raid was terror all over Florida, and all the Blacks who could left for the Bahamas. On December 28, 1835, Major Francis Dade began leading 110 soldiers from Fort Brooks, present-day Tampa, on a resupply mission to Fort King, Slicka, present-day Ocala. Prior to reaching Fort King, Dade and his men were attacked by 180 Seminole Indians. Only 3 soldiers survived. This was known as the Dade City Massacre. The proclamation also announced, so we still on a brief timeline of slavery, because from 1776 or 1669, when the first Africans was documented to arrive in Jamestown, Virginia, all the way up until 1865, we had niggas being brought over here on the back of slave ships, butt booty naked, getting robbed of their nation, their tongue, their heritage, their culture, their God. But in 1865, a proclamation was announced, the acceptance of black men in the Union forces, and by the end of the war, about 180,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and for freedom. Nearly 40,000 died over the course of the war, most from disease. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, as the nation faced the third year of the Civil War. It declared that all slaves within the rebellious states, which is the South, are and henceforth shall be free. It was a turning point in the war, making the battle for human freedom a key focus. However, enforcement on the proclamation depended on Union victory. And as the war raged, many slave owners had moved west to Texas, far from Union lines. Slaves far from Union-held territory had no way to know they must know they was free, man. The Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for the 13th Amendment, outlawing slavery, passed April 8, 1864. It was not until December 18, 1865, with the war over, that the necessary 3/4 of the states ratified the amendment, ensuring forever that neither what? Slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except as a punishment of crime. So as we see here to the bottom right, we have a map of the Negro land. This is a map of Africa during the slave trade, and these are the areas that the colonists went to get their stock, to get their slaves. And as you can see, Negro land and Guinea is what it was called. So the 13th Amendment, it states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or in place subject to their jurisdiction. So all the way up 1619 to 1865, 1808, the institution, the transatlantic slave trade ended, but the institution of slavery didn't get abolished until 1865. 1865. And that's real important to know. And we might think of Florida postcards as harmless depiction of fun in the sun produced for the amusement of black folks back home, but some vintage cards in our collection reveal another side, showing that tourist Florida was above all a white person's paradise. African Americans rarely appear on cards from the 19th and 20th century except as occasional background caddies and waiter servants, but in a significant number they are front and center, especially in a now shocking range of cards where they have seen being attacked by alligators or serving as alligator bait. We present some here. In these images, black adults are coons, darkies, or worse, children are pickaninnies, often caricatured as hapless victims presented with exaggerated menstrual features. They provided laughs for white audiences. Beneath the laughs lurked a deep hostilities towards black people, as in this especially offensive example. Now, this is in a museum in my neighborhood that I was raised in, which was formerly segregated, called the Cepphus Springs Museum and Heritage Center. And they have these postcards to highlight the thoughts and ideas and attitudes of the times. And as you can see, it ain't no respect. Gator bait. I used to wonder why my granddad ain't never liked the Florida Gators. He said the alligator bait image usually depicting babies and small children being eyed as food by an alligator wasn't confined to postcard. It was seen on advertisement, tourist memorabilia, and tour sites such as Souvenir Fan from an alligator farm in St. Pete. We ain't got to go far. We ain't even much got to leave outside the county. Folklorist Patricia Turner wrote that such artifacts depict more than just the presence of negative stereotype. They implicitly represent a form of aggression and eradicating an unwanted people. Unwanted people. They have been claims that black babies really were once used as bait in alligator hunting. Most scholars dispute this, saying these rumors are part of a wider hostile myth about hated groups. They point to similar myths worldwide, such as British colonialists using native babies to bait crocodiles in India. Some might argue that these offensive and violent images should be kept under wraps. We see them as a part of Florida history that must be confronted. State of Florida, land of the Gators, Gator bait. Huh? So we going over this because it's good. You have to know when slavery was abolished in 1865, that did not abolish the hate that white people had towards these niggas. The niggers, the coons, the pickaninnies. Because we went into the Jim Crow era where they still had laws segregating, discriminating, denying services to black people, known as the Black Codes. You know, and Florida was one of the most dangerous for blacks during the Jim Crow era. Why? Because we was the gator bait. Florida was the runaway state where all the slaves saw freedom. This is what black people came to because it wasn't colonized yet. So we had communities. We had independence. But Florida was the most dangerous state. Because why? It was too many niggas here and they had to take control. So the Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. U.S. Supreme Plessy versus Ferguson ruling upheld it, requiring separate but equal treatment. Man, you got plenty of laws that they have from Alabama to Nebraska to Georgia, all over, man. Historical trauma, man. Historical trauma. When are you going to recognize and realize slavery and the negative effects children face during their lifetime as a result of adverse childhood experiences? The effects of slavery and the embodiment in the generations and the social conditions. The historical trauma is the cause for the lack of motivation to engage in school, the alcohol and other drug abuse, unhealthy dietary behaviors, immorality and unhealthy social interactions, inadequate physical activities, sexual behaviors related to unintentional pregnancies and STDs. These are the effects of slavery and integration. Now, although children of the slave trade are negatively impacted as a whole, it's important to realize that not every child suffers from these consequences. The effects of slavery does not necessarily sentence a child to an impaired life, because some people have been blessed to have buffers in their life and they want to hit as hard with that whip from the white man and his system. So moving forward, we're going to go into identifying the cultural heritage of American descendants of slaves. And first, we're going to touch on terminology, because African American, also referred to as Black Americans or Afro-Americans, are an ethnic group of Americans with total or partial ancestry from any of the Black racial groups of Africa. The term African American generally denotes descendants of enslaved Black people who are from the United States, while some recent immigrants or their children may also come to identify as African American or may identify themselves differently. And according to the U.S. Census Bureau, African immigrants generally do not self-identify as African Americans. They overwhelmingly majority of African immigrants identify instead with their own respective ethnicity. And this is very important that you have to realize, because the American descendants of slaves were the only people that were enslaved, and which resulted in their culture, their heritage, their language, and the knowledge of who they were has been taken from them. An immigrant knows his language, an immigrant knows his culture, an immigrant knows where he comes from, but not a descendant of a slave. The first language the descendant of a slave is taught is the language of his slave master, English. Whatever land, whatever country, whatever colonizer colonized you, that is your language. So it's very important to recognize and realize and have an understanding that the term African American was specifically labeled to those descendants of slaves. Going back over to 1808, the U.S. banned it. But remember, slavery wasn't abolished until 1865. The slave trade was banned in 1808. Whew. And going into the secrets of these white people that couldn't follow the rules and the laws, let's go into the Lightburn secret. Man, oh man, oh man, oh man, oh man, because the enslaved people had the names of their slave masters. And my name just happens to be Lightburn. So the story of Styles Edward Lightburn, a slave trader from South Carolina, is very intriguing to me, and has become a centerpiece of history during the years of the American Revolution and the American Civil War. Mr. Lightburn, he married a woman from prominent region in Guinea, over there where they was going there getting them slaves, and he had a lot of brothers in the slave trade. They operated decades after the slave trade, man, was banned in 1808. So this man, he went over there, he started a family, y'all. So what he did, listen, when they banned in the 1808, these white people, they went over there and they started making families so that they continue to have that trade, that business, man. That's what was going on. They was over there making mulattoes. You know what I'm saying? Like, man, this is like very intriguing. It's the world's best kept secret to me, because I identify my slave master. The only thing that we know, you know what I'm saying, is our last name. Where we get our names from, we don't know our daddies. All we know is our slave master. And I just so happened to find mine, Mr. Lightburn. Oh, Mr. Lightburn. So political concepts. The term African American was coined by Jesse Jackson in the 1980s, carrying important political overtones. Earlier terms used to describe Americans of African ancestry referred more to skin color than to ancestry, and were conferred upon the group by colonists and Americans of European ancestry. People with dark skins were considered inferior in fact and in law. Other terms such as colored, person of color, Afro-American, or Negro were included in the wording of various laws and legal decisions, which some thought were being used as tools of white supremacy and oppression. So what does that mean? That African American is a term. We was being called all these bywords and proverbs ever since we came here. Colored nigga-boo, jigaboo, pickaninny, coon, porch monkey, everything. And in the 1980s, we finally got coined the term African Americans by who? By a politician, by Jesse Jackson. What happened? We used to be called Negro when they was going to get a Negro from the Negro land. Do we got to go back to the map? Negro.